What's your name?
Buster.
Is this your real name?
No.
How would you describe yourself?
I'm an American deserter.
And why did you desert?
Because America is fighting in Vietnam.
And this is not an isolated case. In a few minutes, International Magazine brings you this story.
Breakfast where the news is read, television, children fed, unborn living, living dead. Bullet strikes the helmet's head, and it's all over for the unknown soldier. It's all over for the unknown soldier.
In London. Tonight, International Magazine looks at the chief victim of the Russian Revolution 50 years after. Then we'll examine two efforts to make life swing, one in England and one in Hungary. But first, we bring you a report that even Americans who are opposed to the war in Vietnam may find disturbing. Here in Western Europe, just as in America, Vietnam is an emotional political issue. Officially, our NATO allies all support the war. But in every country in Western Europe, except of course France, pressure groups are trying to force their governments to condemn the war and demand American withdrawal. There are student demonstrations in Berlin. In Hamburg, bottles are thrown through the windows of the American consulate. In Amsterdam, the American flag is burned in public squares. And here in London, giant peace marches are held at least once a month. Even in Sweden, a strictly neutral country, pressure groups pushed the government into allowing the much-publicized mock trial of President Johnson as a war criminal. But demonstrations, peace marches, and flag burnings are one thing. They're done out in the open and are, in a sense, legitimate. The film we're going to show you now is about a completely different type of protest. It's about a secret underground network operating in almost every country in Western Europe. This film was made by Rediffusion Television of London, and the reporter is Peter Williams.
The largest army in Europe today belongs to the United States. 225,000 combat troops, most of them stationed in Germany, help to make up what NATO terms its protective shield that straddles the continent from Norway to Turkey. They play the war games that are the homework of an army when it has no battles to fight. But these are also the men who may at short notice find themselves pitched into a real shooting war, the war in Vietnam. Because of the Vietnam War, these GIs in Germany have been under a new sort of pressure, a pressure to desert. Various groups in Western Europe are urging these men to make their own personal protest. Go absent, they're told, and there are people in Europe who will look after you. Walk out of your barracks. Desert.
Vietnam-bulletinen.
One GI in every 3 is said to have read these leaflets. If that's so, the average American soldier denies being influenced by them. But is there an organization backing the claims made in the leaflets? This week's investigations took us to Germany, Holland and Belgium, France, Sweden and Britain, because it's in London that the trail begins, at a backstreet printing press that's already been raided by Scotland Yard's special branch. The US military authorities dispute that the activities of the various anti-Vietnam groups in Europe have had any effect either on troop morale or on the number of GIs deserting from the US Army in Germany. But they refused to be questioned on the subject and confined their comments on the facts presented to them to this short statement. In the first 6 months of this year, 522 men have gone absent without leave from the US Army in Europe. That's an average of 87 a month. But this number cannot be construed as representing bona fide deserters, as at this time it's not possible to say how many of these men can be legally convicted of intending to absent themselves permanently from the service. No figures are available for bona fide deserters. In this same 6 months, the statement points out, more than 10,000 GIs volunteered for service in Vietnam. But in country after country, there is evidence that a network exists. First, to encourage the GI to desert, and second, to protect him once he goes absent. Paris is the hub of the network, perhaps because of President de Gaulle's declared attitude to the Vietnam War, certainly because of France's withdrawal from NATO, and because of the colonies of American expatriates and left-wingers that are part of the city's tradition. The chief of the anti-Vietnam network in France is a man known as Tommy or Mr. Cook. To reach him involved a series of maneuvers straight out of spy fiction, a series of cautious telephone calls from nameless people, and a final rendezvous in this bookshop in the shadow of Notre Dame, a shop over which Hemingway once lived, wrote, and absorbed the flavor of Paris.
You might be able to put me in touch with a man called Tommy, who's also known as Mr. Cook.
The aim was to reach the leaders of the network. The next day, it was arranged that I should stand as unobtrusively as any Briton in a Paris street and wait. Are you from Mr. Cook?
Yes. Don't try to see where we are going, and I don't want you to show any pictures of the way, all right?
Okay.
Get in.
The van was as anonymous as its driver. We traveled north for 2 hours. This man is known as Tommy or Mr. Cook. He's the leader of the movement in France.
I must ask you, are you a communist?
Hard thing. Could you define that? I don't think any communist party I know would consider me a very good communist. They don't like, communist parties are usually very disciplined organizations. Now, we have communists who work in our organization, in our groups, let's put it. But I don't think that the communist parties, the different countries that we work on, would like to be identified as parties in taking an active part. Of course, they never refuse help now.
Have you contacts within the German police network?
I wouldn't know, and I wouldn't be able to answer that. That's not my problem. But we have many contacts inside the American Army.
Inside the American Army?
Of course.
Actual serving officers?
Of course.
So that the people within the US Army are in fact the beginning of the pipeline?
Yes.
What happens then?
Well, usually they don't do anything until one day somebody tells them, which is illegal, that within a couple of weeks or so he's liable to be on 30-day leave in the States and then on the way to Vietnam. Some of them get drunk, who hear about this. Well, most of them, of course, go to Vietnam. Well, let's not kid ourselves. As far as we know, the present desertion rate, it's up. It's about 90 a month. That's our latest information in Germany.
The network has a code name for the deserters. It calls them babies. This particular baby is known as Buster. He deserted a year ago and now lives undercover in a French village. He works in the building trade. Members of the network vetted my questions as I asked when he decided to desert.
About 2 days before I left,
And what happened?
I left.
What happened 2 days before you left?
No comment.
Did you in fact receive information that you were yourself going to Vietnam?
No comment. That's 18 months. Prison sentence.
How did you go about deserting?
Well, I left Germany, and I hitchhiked to the Holland border, and I got a ride in a truck right up into Amsterdam. And after walking around for about 24 hours, I went to the train station, and I saw some long-haired guys. I started talking to them, and they looked at me and just asked me if I was an American deserter. So I thought, well, I might as well try saying yes, so I told them yes.
How did you feel at this moment?
Tired.
Were you desperate?
No, I think I could have lasted a little bit longer without eating.
What were you wearing that you were so recognizable as an American deserter?
I had short hair.
Doesn't anybody else have short hair in Amsterdam?
Not like in the army.
And what happened once you'd met the provost?
Well, they took me to a place where I could stay, and they put me up for a while until they could find a semi-permanent place. And then they shipped me out to another country.
How did they ship you out, as you put it?
In a car.
And?
They drove me through the border.
Did you have false papers at this time?
Yes.
Where did you get these from?
No comment.
Did you get these false papers before you left the army?
Yes.
Were they forged?
No comment.
Buster's leave pass was forged, but he still reached Amsterdam. The experts say it's relatively easy to get there because of the thousands of GIs genuinely on leave. The would-be deserter mingles with them and follows the lead given in the leaflet. He contacts the provost, a group of Dutch teenagers well versed in the techniques of protest. He knows he must move quickly because, although there are no extradition treaties with the United States, Holland is a fellow member of NATO. The rendezvous with the provost isn't difficult. This first deserter who came to you,
Yes.
did you at any time think that he might well have been planted on you?
I don't think so, no. He was too panicky. You know, a planned one must have some slickness about him, and this one didn't have at all.
What did you talk about? What did he say?
Nothing. He was just a huge American sitting in my room and not saying anything. He was from Texas, and very slowly I could get out of him that yes, he wanted tea, or no, he didn't want tea. That was the only thing I could get out of him.
Are you a communist?
A communist? No, I'm an anarchist.
A network lives on the quality of its liaison work. From Amsterdam, Ton Rechtin is one of the few people who keep in touch with the movements in France and Belgium. How many deserters has Amsterdam handled in the past year?
Well, I think there had been official figures about it, but I think it will be more than 60, 70 a year.
What do you do with them once you've decided that this GI is a GI who might well be a deserter?
Well, he's always somewhere in the city, you know. 1 million people, a lot of houses, a lot of rooms, a lot of friendly people, a lot of Vietnam activists. It's always very easy to bring them somewhere in a house where they can stay and eat and stay for some time, maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And then we put them in a car and bring them to Paris.
What difficulties do you encounter when you're trying to get a GI out of Holland, through Belgium and into France?
Well, The only difficulty is the passing of the frontier. And there's a pass control and control of papers of the car and all these kind of things. And it's always the risk, that's the point of the risk, to bring them over the frontier. But up till now, the control was that weak that it was very easy to get them over the frontier. That's our part of the route. Then it's up to the Belgians, and then it's up to the people from France.
Today, the deserter has at least two choices once he's made his contact. The first route takes him through Holland to Liège or Antwerp and on to Paris. The second leads from northern Germany by transcontinental train to Denmark and then to Sweden, a neutral nation outside NATO. Ray Jones was drafted into the US Army in February 1966. 6 months ago, he deserted to Sweden. Now, as a Negro, he stands out in the Stockholm crowd, where he lives with his German girlfriend. He wanted political asylum. He got the next best thing, legal permission to live and work in Sweden, and a foreigner's passport. His case is considered by a commission every 6 months, but while in Sweden, he receives the legal protection given every Swedish citizen. He fought and won his case on humanitarian grounds with the aid of a leading Swedish lawyer. The movement and Jones himself consider the ruling a breakthrough. But Jones and the men like him who decide to desert risk perhaps 5 years in an American prison. And these are men who may never again be permitted to set foot in their native land. How did the idea for deserting develop from the beginnings in Texas?
Well, it began when, after a while, after staying in Texas a while, the amount of Negroes went up going to Vietnam. It steadily went up, and there was always a great chance of my going there because of my profession in the military.
Which was?
A scout. I was a, what you call, armored intelligence specialist. Yes, armored intelligence specialist. This is the way it's written on paper, but it's actually a scout. And there was a great chance that I would be sent being a scout.
Why?
Well, this is the worst position in the military because you're easily killed, first of all. And this is where I started seeing discrimination because more Negroes were scouts and had this type position. This is when I started discussing evading, or deserting rather.
How did you feel when you stepped ashore in Sweden?
I was very happy because I knew now I was on legal grounds. Because everything had to have to be legal because everyone can be imprisoned if things aren't legal. Even though Sweden is a neutral country, certain organizations can easily kidnap you and work with you from there. So everything has to be legal.
What do you mean kidnap in certain organizations?
It's impossible for me to mention an organization, but there is an organization that is kidnapping people or that has kidnapped people and still are kidnapping people. And there's always a chance you have to take. Whenever you start something like this, you always take the chance of being killed or kidnapped, especially when you're working on legal grounds.
You mean kidnapped for money?
No, definitely not for money. Kidnapped for security of the people kidnapping you, for their own security.
Do you mean by some American agency?
Yes, yes.
The CIA?
I wouldn't say. This is something I couldn't say. I'd be incriminating myself if I said it. I refuse to use that word.
The Paris network claim a similar success. One US corporal has been given permission to live and work in France. But every deserter has one thing in common: the knowledge of the pressure that bears down on him, whether he's gone absent because of Vietnam or simply because he hated his top sergeant. The young GI on the run must ask himself every day of his life, where does courage end and foolishness take over? In your everyday life, how careful have you to be?
I'm just human. I walk down the street too.
But how careful have you to be? Are you always aware of the fact that you're a deserter? Do you ever forget this?
No, I'm kind of proud of it.
Are you ever aware of any investigation of yourself by possible CIA agents?
Well, it's possible. So far, they've been pretty dumb.
You mean they're dumb because they haven't caught you?
That's about it.
How do you feel now as a deserter who, if you like, has
run out on his country?
I haven't actually run out. I feel I'm fighting for my country. I'm fighting for the freedom of people, which my country claims to be stating to doing now.
Do you think that the GIs who are fighting in Vietnam at the moment would agree with you?
Well, I've read a couple pamphlets that were from some GIs in Vietnam, and they want out. I've also read about other GIs getting shot for refusing to fight, people going to jail, things like this, for refusing to fight.
But the statistics would seem to prove that these are in the minority and that the majority of GIs in Vietnam are fighting in Vietnam.
Mainly because they don't know what it's really about.
But they're there.
Sure they're there.
And you haven't been there.
That's right.
And you don't think that they might be right and you might be wrong?
No.
What have you told the people at home about your decision to desert?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing.
One thing we try not to encourage too greatly a degree is that they should not form deserters' clubs. This is for a particular reason which you may understand or not. We don't know who is genuine and who is not. Obviously, the one way we can be got at is to send us people who are fake deserters. I mean, who are CID. Most of the attempts of this have been very, very stupid. But obviously, the first time that it isn't stupid, we'll be in trouble too. So we don't let them meet too many of each other. Most of them, very rarely do they know more than 3, 4, 5 other people in their situation. And if we can help it, not even that many.
What proportion of would-be deserters are successful once you know of their wish to desert?
Well, as a matter of when, right now I would say more than 90% of those that have contacted our groups or have been in contact with friends are more or less taken care of once they've got that far.
Well, how do you lose the odd 10%?
Well, you is big because I don't know how many I've lost personally. But there have been, I'll give you the dramatic cases because I guess that's what you want. One guy who was working with us, who'd been working with us for quite a while, was found dead. He'd been done in. And I guess he was lost. And it wasn't an accident.
How was he done in?
I don't think I can give any detail. I've been told I can say that it would happen. I can't say where it happened, when, or how, too much. He was found in a deserted building, dead. And he did not die of peaceful means.
Ray Jones seems to fear being kidnapped.
We've had 2 cases that I know of.
Tell me about them.
They walked down the street, a car stopped, and people asked them to they got into the car, or they were pushed in the car. I wasn't there to see how it happened, and they were never seen again.
Which country did this happen in?
A neutral country. No comment, no further comment.
How active is the CIA against you?
I don't know. Maybe it's sitting on the other side of the screen. Maybe I'm a paranoiac by now.
American deserters who are caught, as the film pointed out, are subject to 5 years imprisonment. This is a very light sentence compared with what it used to be. At one time, the penalty was death. Curiously enough, that law was changed during a war that was almost as unpopular and controversial as the Vietnam conflict. This was the Mexican War of 1847. At the height of that conflict, a whole battalion of Irish immigrant draftees went over the hill because they felt closer to the Catholic Mexicans than to the American Protestant commanders. They were finally captured, and 50 of them were hanged before the officer in charge got a telegram from Washington saying that the death penalty had been abolished for deserters. The rest were set free, with nothing more than the letter D branded on their cheeks. And now we turn to a man who was forced to desert, not the army, but his country. This October marks the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. The Tsar and his immediate family were massacred, but most of the Romanovs escaped. Since then, they've been living in Europe, and some in America. And while the name Romanov means nothing in Russia, it still carries weight elsewhere in the world. The Romanovs are supposed to be worth about $27 million. And since 1933, there have been bitter court battles over which Romanov is heir to the fortune. The battle is between two women, the Duchess Barbara von Mecklenburg, who says she's the closest surviving relative, and a woman who claims to be Anastasia, one of the Tsar's own daughters. But while the costliest legal case in the world drags on, there's one Romanov, a man, recognized by the entire family as the head of the Imperial House of Romanov. He's not contesting the family fortune. He's the grandnephew of the Tsar, the closest male descendant. Michael Barrett of the BBC visited the Grand Duke Vladimir Romanov on the anniversary of the revolution that exiled him.
The Emperor of Russia, Nicholas II, in 1917. The Emperor of Russia, Vladimir, 50 years later, in 1967. He lives now in a suburb of Madrid with his wife, the Grand Duchess Leonida, and his 13-year-old daughter, the Grand Duchess Maria. It's a home with a pleasant garden most of us would envy. But as the family seat of the Romanovs, it's a pathetic contrast with the glittering court of his predecessor. When Nicholas II walked down the steps of the Kremlin Palace in 1896, on his way to be crowned emperor, he must have thought that the Romanov dynasty would go on forever. Yet the House of Romanov was doomed. Far from Moscow, in Petrograd, it was like the French Revolution, with the crowd singing the Marseillaise and freeing political prisoners. Symbols of the monarchy were smashed. They'd never again be more than rubble. And then the monarchy itself crashed. Nicholas abdicated and left the palace with his family to spend a year in exile before all of them were shot in 1918 by order of a local Soviet. As the Russian Revolution gathered momentum, no one cared about the birth in Finland of a baby called Vladimir Romanov.
I was born in Finland, curiously enough, because my parents left St. Petersburg, where they're living, in 17, just during the Kerensky government. And my mother was expecting me, and I was born there in August 17, 30th of August to be precise.
Does this mean that you have never in all your life set foot in your own country in Russia?
Well, yes and no, because Finland, the moment when I was born, was still Russia. So, although I don't remember it, I can say that I have been in my country and was born in Russia still.
Of all the lost causes, and I think you'd agree there are many among the exiled monarchs of Europe, many people would call yours the most lost, as it were. Would you call this an ignorant opinion?
Well, no, I wouldn't really call it an ignorant opinion, because the outer, one might say, symptoms, or the possibility, of course, as you say, seems rather remote, chiefly because of the apparently very firm position of the Soviet regime in Russia. But I think that, as I said before already, that a change is not impossible. That if such a change come about, that the people as such of Russia would more likely turn to monarchy than, shall we say, to some democratic form of government.
Do you then see yourself, as others do, to whom I've spoken, as preparing yourself deliberately for a kingly role, an imperial role in your case?
Well, that's also rather difficult to find a precise reply, but to a certain extent, yes, because my parents already prepared me as much as they could.
In what way?
Circumstances in a matter of education.
Well, what kind of education was this?
Such possible role sometime in the future. Well, simply giving me as broad an education as possible. And of course with definite and very detailed knowledge of my own country.
Today, Madrid society humors the pretensions of the Grand Duke Vladimir, but his imperial dignity is largely restricted to the confines of his own family. He and his wife, once a princess in Georgia, and their daughter are virtually inseparable. They have a strict rule that on any long journey, all three travel together. They say they prefer to die together than leave the teenage Grand Duchess alone in the world. He lives comfortably enough, and if he never even sees the country his family once ruled, at least he may never face a firing squad either.
While there are dozens of dethroned royalty and their pretenders, only 7 monarchs still reign in Europe. 2 of them, in Belgium and Greece, still play a political role in their countries. And 2 others, the queens of Great Britain and Holland, are still respected and cared for. But in Scandinavia, the 3 remaining monarchs have been pretty well stripped of privilege, and their influence is nil. In Sweden, in fact, there's a good chance that the monarchy will be allowed to lapse with the death of King Gustav. However, in Denmark, the royal house may last forever, and for a very practical reason. The Danes have worked it out that it's cheaper to pay $700,000 a year to support the royal family than to pay for a presidential election every 4 years. And now we go to Hungary. Budapest, like Moscow, marks an anniversary this month. For the Hungarians, it's just 11 years since they lost their desperate bid for freedom from their communist masters. Ever since, they've been clamped by rigid communist domination. But there are signs that the clamp is being eased off. Just last March, in fact, an election was actually held in Hungary, and 9 opposition candidates were allowed to appear on the ballot. All 9 were soundly defeated, which rather amused the Hungarians, since all 9 had been selected by the Communist Party anyhow. Also, the party bosses have recently hinted that the fruits of socialism, with a little luck, will be enjoyed by this generation of Hungarians. The reason for rising living standards, of course, is public rather than private enterprise. Every facet of production is guided by collective decisions, from tractors and television sets, even to the clothes that Hungarian women wear. Well, now we're going to the Váci utca, the 5th Avenue of Budapest, to see how the communist system tries to make its women look elegant. Budapest was once a proud center of high fashion. In the old days before communism, its aristocratic styles, its fabric designs, its chic women were a challenge even to Paris. Today, the Hungarians are having another go. Once again, fashion is a #1 industry, but now it's state-controlled fashion, aimed to bring elegance within reach of the pocket of every good communist.
Mai tervismertető értekezletünket megnyitom.
Kapacitásunk már túlterhelt, úgyhogy meg kell keresni azt a módot, hogy...
Like everything else, chic has been nationalized. These Budapest bureaucrats are Hungary's answer to Pierre Balmain. These are the party men who meet to decide exactly where the party hemline is to be.
Szerint az itt elmondott munkaügyi és egyéb problémák nem lehetnek akadályai egy plusz termelés átvételének.
Harmadik negyedévben ott van a Goldbergernek és a Pistesnek van leállása.
Nur ein Glas, sei nur ein großes Licht und macht.
Fabric designing has been taken over by the state as well. Last year, no less than 2,000 samples were centrally planned and produced. Nearly half of them did not sell. That didn't stop them from producing another 2,000 this year.
Na, kedves elvtársak, a jelenlétív szerint mindenki itt van. Megkezdjük a kétnapos értekezletet.
State planners not only prepare, but carefully check each design, both from artist sketches and from samples printed on material.
Anyagok deszének kiválasztása.
The plan, which is enforced by law, covers machines as well as men. The machines are mainly run by women because there's no room for personal initiative in this industry, and the men won't take the jobs. 30% of the workers in the Hungarian textile industry change their jobs every year. The master plan extends logically to every branch of family life, down to state-aided kindergartens. The calculation is simple. Without kindergartens, no mothers at the machines. Without female labor, no fulfillment of the plan. The plan takes care of everything. To keep the girls from flirting with the men during their coffee break, there's handball. Meanwhile, the men keep on at their allotted jobs. More planning. They don't take time out for play. They talk, plan, deliberate, and plan some more.
Artószrámák kapacitása biztosítja azt.
De az ő részükről nem indul, és nem a mi részünkről van probléma.
Arról nem volt szó. Módosítani. Cikket, amit a kis textbe fognak lenyomni.
Bérmunkatételek kerülnek be.
Áru kikészítése a textilfestőben történt.
És azon kívül kellett volna a jugoszláv bérmunkát nekünk exportot kontrolláld le, légy szíves. Én mondom, hogy lejjebb vették, mert mi kész. Van egy 70-es -10. Ott kellett az exportot csak. Akkor a probléma csak ott volt, a stimmel, ugye, PNV-t. Megbeszélem és vissza be. A spánfix. Kikészített számát. Jó, 300 vagy 6. Tásra feltétlen szükséget pamutba. Került be a bérmunka, kérték vagy nem kért.
And to make sure the planners themselves don't make mistakes, the regime uses mechanical state brains as well. This computer was imported at vast cost from America. Every month, 250,000 punch cards pour out their instructions. Hungarian styles may not reach the West, but Hungarian fabrics do. The export commissars may not like the flower people their flowered fabrics go to, but they love the hard currency they bring in. The plan dictates that packers at this plant must wrap up 200 bales an hour, 500 meters of cloth a day. Each bale packed and stitched by these men helps pay off Hungary's massive balance of payments deficit. The materials are exported all over the world, from Panama to Casablanca.
Gabriela elvtársnő ezért szintén az ezüst fokozat kitüntetést.
The cash incentive is not allowed in communist countries. This is the Iron Curtain's answer to the productivity bonus, the badge of merit. It's given for fulfilling the plan and presented publicly to applause from fellow workers. This is the big moment every good communist worker is taught to dream of. Instead of the check written by the employer, the Hungarian worker has to make do with autographs from his comrades. Finally, the big moment comes, too, for the dresses produced by the state-controlled, computerized master plan. Will they sell?
The prices are all nearly the same, so that every woman can afford one. What it takes to make them sell is a good sales pitch.
Szeretném még ezt a kettőt megvenni, mert olyan ízléses és olyan csinosak. Ugye ebbe a zöldbe, ebbe a sárgába, hát nagyon tetszik. Ez volt az a minta, amit ön keresett? Pontosan ez volt, igen. Én is, igen.
But sales resistance, even in a communist society, can be tough.
Hát még nézzünk, nem néztünk még.
I have not found anything I want to buy. I am looking for something gay and modern. The styles here seem very old-fashioned. Nothing here is quite me. I am still looking. I want something that is fun to wear, something different. I don't see it here.
40% of women leave this clothing store without buying anything. The fact is, many Hungarian women haven't got the party message. They'd rather stitch up and make their own clothes. Their answer, no doubt, is that there's one snag the state hasn't yet learned to overcome: dowdiness.
11 years after the uprising, the Hungarians still think of themselves as Western Europeans and want to be like the people on the other side of the Iron Curtain. For instance, the citizens of Budapest and even the authorities concerned with tourism love to boast of the terrifying volume of traffic in their capital. Traffic has indeed increased in the last few years since ordinary people have been allowed to buy cars. Yet Budapest traffic is a trickle by Western standards. Instead of boasting about how fast and thick it is, the tourist people would do better to advertise, "Come to Budapest, drive your car in comfort and park it anywhere you like." That would bring in Western visitors. But the people of Budapest would most certainly not go along with this image of their city. They go on dreaming of traffic jams. And now we move to Great Britain. The British Parliament has just gone into its fall session, and one thing members will be doing is taking a second look at the country's very liberal drug law. This law allows hardcore addicts to get all the drugs they need, and for free. Britain has always believed that making drugs legal is the only way to control their use. And until recent years, it has worked out that way. The rate of addiction here was only 1 in 100,000, about 1/10 of the rate in America. But lately it's been discovered that registered addicts have been getting extra supplies from their doctor and peddling them to youngsters. The drug rate has doubled, and worried members of Parliament are now going to set up drug centers so that the free supplies can be controlled. Soft drugs are also getting some attention from this session of the British Parliament. Members are having to face up to the problem of the mind-expanding drugs, a problem only recently imported from America. It was brought to London straight from San Francisco by the hippie movement. Here's a BBC report on the flower people of Britain.
Literally hundreds of different causes are paraded at Speaker's Corner in London under the tolerant eye of the British police. The hippie movement might have been just such another cause, but for one thing: drugs. Their campaign for freedom to use drugs as a shortcut to happiness brought hippies into an open clash with the law.
We've just been told by the buzz that we can't use our loudspeaking equipment. You don't need to worry about that, because this is not a rally, it's a picnic. And we're not going to have lots of speeches. We're going to have lots of poets and lots of musicians.
The British hippie cult is an import from America. Like their American counterparts, they believe in free expression of the individual. There's just one issue on which they're solidly united: beating the drug law.
The police won't let us use the microphones because they don't want you to hear what we're saying. They don't want you to know what your rights are when you're arrested.
You have to get permission from the Ministry of War.
On other issues, British hippies aren't too clear what they stand for. There's a hazy interest in Eastern mysticism. But their messiah comes from the West, the American poet Allen Ginsberg.
the god Shiva, god of meditation, asceticism, birth, death, change, creation, destruction, and ganja. Hari Om Namo Shivaya. Hari Om Namo Shivaya.
For this generation, the search for earthly paradise actually does lead towards Shangri-La. Hippies dream of going to Nepal, because that's where you find the best hashish. Their slogan is "Make love, not war." Being peace-loving citizens, when the law attacks them, they're taught to hit back not with guns, but with flower power. Their weapons, even against a down-to-earth cop, carnations and sweet Williams. Another import from the States is the hippies' mouthpiece, the International Times, which now has a London office. It sells 20,000 copies on both sides of the Atlantic, and it's the nearest thing to a hippie manifesto. But do hippies have any political attitudes?
The main political attitude is that, I'd say we think politics as they are something rather funny. We'd rather disassociate ourselves with politics and politicians as they are, except, of course, when they make ridiculous laws and legislate in rather stupid ways, and it affects the individual. Then we obviously, as individuals, have to try to do something about it.
The beautiful people wear their own distinctive clothes. But is their contempt for convention not in itself just another sort of convention?
Why do you wear the clothes you do?
Because I like pretending.
Pretending what?
Well, if I'm dressed like this, I think I'm a fairy princess, but sometimes I think I'm a turn-up kid or cowboy, something like that, you know.
What do you mean by a beautiful being? Just feeling beautiful, or being good, or being what? What do you mean by projecting beauty?
What you feel beautiful. I mean,
being
I
loved.
feel beautiful most of the time anyway. I say to a lot of my friends. I realize not everybody does. That's why they have to groove around in sort of black and white. And that's the whole of their lives. That's their whole scene, black and white, you know.
The flower is the hippie's symbol of the free life. But unlike American hippies, who are full-time dropouts from society, Britishers tend to be part-time hippies, who just dropped in for the weekend. Today's hippies are yesterday's Beatle fans. Scratch a British hippie and you find pop music. This is a hippie apartment, London style. In America, hippies live free in hippievilles called dream drones. In London, a free apartment for hippies just means somebody's got a rich friend.
Sue, you think that drugs are helping the younger generation to discover what life is about?
Oh, yes, definitely.
In what way?
They make you become much less aware of your ego and sort of, you know, yourself, your possessions. You're this, you're that, and you become much more aware that you're a part of a whole. You're not just a sort of entity on your own. And you can live much more easily with people once you're not sort of bothered about what's theirs and what's yours.
It's much simpler because people become themselves. They're so much more natural.
I think now that people aren't sort of bound by things like marriage, so you get much more sort of real relationships with people. People don't have this incredible possession thing about each other.
You just can't possess another person.
My boyfriend, my girlfriend, it's all gone.
My husband. I don't think I could ever love anybody for long enough
to go on forever?
There's so many people to love. I mean, you can't just love exclusively
just
one
pick
person.
one and love him.
What about your child? Would you be happy if your child grew up and took drugs? Would you encourage it to do so?
I wouldn't encourage it, I wouldn't discourage it. I would obviously discourage her from taking sort of heroin and cocaine and things like that, but if she wanted to smoke hash, she could smoke hash. You know, I obviously don't want her to smoke it when she's about 3 or something, because she's going to get lung cancer, but, you know, apart from that. It's like cigarettes. If she wants to smoke cigarettes, she can smoke them.
But when you get, you're both beautiful and young girls, when you get older, isn't it a rather grim prospect, when here you are, colourful and young, and you look at the grey people who you can't break through to, the older generation, but when you're the older generation, don't you begin to want some permanences?
But you're assuming that all we are is the clothes we wear and the way we look. I mean, that's the least important thing about any of us. That's just decorations and paraphernalia. Because of what's underneath, I think we'll be happy. Because there is something underneath. We don't need a convention of clothes, a convention of anything. It's all changing. Because the underneath is constant.
And what sort of world do you think this is going to produce?
Very beautiful world. Very beautiful world.
Paradise.
One reason why the British Parliament is talking about easing up on soft drugs is that the penalties are so harsh. This is all the more dramatic in England because here the law is so soft when it comes to the hard drugs. Just recently, the law toward legalizing soft drugs was given a big push by the well-publicized arrest of Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. The court apparently wanted to make an example of him and sentenced him to 3 months in jail for possessing 4 pep pills. There was such an uproar, not only from the flower people, but from even the very voice of the establishment, the Times, that another judge reversed the decision. And now to Southeast Asia. Not to Vietnam, but to Thailand. Thailand is now officially acknowledged as America's chief staging point for the Vietnam War. Our heavy bombers operate from Thai bases in their daily runs on the north. We're building up to a ground support force of 100,000 men in Thailand, and already the capital, Bangkok, is beginning to look like a Los Angeles suburb. But some things in Thailand can never become Americanized. Buddhism remains a pillar of Thai life, and this October and November, the biggest Buddhist celebration of the year is taking place. It's the Tad Katim, and here's how the Thais observe it.
For the villages bordering on the Great River, every week from mid-October to mid-November is boat race week. Each boat represents a village, or rather it represents the village monastery. And today 18 boats will battle for the honor of the monastery and to raise money to support the monks who live in it. In the past there were no races. The boats were used, just like the royal barges, to bear the offerings of cloth and other necessities. But over the years racing developed and has now become a major fundraising activity. Each village takes it in turn to be host, and if they don't get a gate of at least 10,000, they're doing badly. Each spectator pays 4p for a day's sport. When the day's takings have been added up, they're hoping for enough to put a new roof on the temple. Particularly in the villages, the monastery and its monks are the focal point of almost all activity. Buddhism is a thread that finds its way into the fabric of everyday life. Even the arrival of the boat teams is strongly ritualistic. They're not just turning up for a sporting event, they're processing ceremonially, dedicating their efforts. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha taught that those in search of spiritual treasure must free themselves of worldly ties, and so he enjoined the monks never to touch gold or silver. Consequently, they rely entirely on the laity to provide all their worldly needs. The church here has never been rich or envied, and so the laity feel themselves under a deep obligation to the monks, believing that making offerings is a certain means of gaining spiritual rewards. Even the boat race itself is a way of gaining merit. Each boat has a crew of 35 who've been in training for 3 months. There's no restriction on the size and weight of the boat, but they're all of the traditional design based on the ancient Thai war canoe. Prosperous villages have their crews rigged out in bright team colours. Their less wealthy neighbours wear out their old clothes. All the craft are decorated with flowers and bananas and trophies won in previous regattas. Since it's a knockout competition with as many as 30 boats competing, the winners will have to race 3 or 4 times in the course of the day. They compete over a distance of 3/4 of a mile with the current, and since there are very definite advantages to be gained from being placed on the far bank, the stations are decided by spinning a coin. Among the crowd, feeling runs pretty strongly, not only because of inter-village rivalry, but because there's a good deal of betting on the result. Unusual, perhaps, in a church fete. But then, as we know them, church fetes never seem to have been designed for actual enjoyment. Apart from gambling, all the Thais need for a great day out is a vast amount of food and noise. But the Thais can afford to do more than just eat. From the quality of the clothes they wear and from the new motorcycles and bicycles, it's evident that there's an appetite for consumer goods and a growing ability to satisfy it. These groups of players travel round to all the boat races and fairs, performing extremely corrupted versions of the traditional lakon, based on Thai history and legend. Often nowadays, the original stories have vanished completely, and the actors write the scripts themselves, or simply improvise on local village scandal and gossip. The jokes are blue, and the plots Rabelaisian, enough to make a monk blush. But then the monks aren't allowed to go to the theatre, and it's a welcome relief from all that boat racing. The final is a grimly fought duel between the favourites. For the winners, a silver challenge cup and much merit. For the losers, the comfort of knowing that though they may have lost their shirt, the monks have got theirs for the coming year at least.
Well, something to think about next time we want to raise funds in the church bazaar. This is David Weber in London. International Magazine will be with you again next month. Good night.
Thank you. This is NET, the National Educational Television Network.